Good morning. I'd like to call the meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee to order. We do have 5 of our members here today. Lisa Vines was not able to join us, so we do have a quorum. I'd like to move for acceptance of our minutes from September 22nd as they were amended. Thank you, Harry.
Second.
Thank you. I do want to thank Lou Mancuso for taking our minutes, and I also want to mention that Terry Burks has stepped up and will be our secretary for our group now. So,
Terry, I'm eternally grateful.
well, he found out what the permanent pay was. I said he found out what the permanent pay was.
I was getting nervous about the rotation.
First of all, we're going to have Pete Finnelli give us an update on the Capital and Reserve Fund.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for attending. I appreciate it. We're trying to present the capital and reserve study updates as frequently as possible. Excuse me. So we're targeting once at every one of the month's 2 BNF meetings. So I hope you find it interesting. We're in pretty good shape. So briefly, the governing board approved last May $5.9 million in capital budget. And I think the next part, I want to give a little bit of a understanding for people. We'll be talking later about encumbrance, so I'm kind of moving that word up to this slide, but hopefully it's pretty straightforward. The capital tracker literally changes every day. So if you walked into my office tomorrow or today, you would have varying numbers on every one of these. But at the point when I put this together, I think it was late last week, we had issued $2.8 million of actual purchase orders. 221,000 of those were on carryovers from prior year, and 2.5 million on the budget items. Relative to the budget items, the governing board approved amount was 2.8 million. So on the purchase order that have 99% completion, we are currently at a $241,000 savings on those. So very good shape on that. What makes up the amount of the purchase orders and the actual savings? The first ones were on the golf maintenance. Represents a big chunk of the budget, so I isolated it pretty much by itself. Golf maintenance equipment, pretty straightforward. 30,000 or so savings against what we've expended. Generally speaking, Todd likes to get those out the door in July and August, and did a good job on getting close to the budget and even under it. Shoreline, real briefly, there's 2 things I want to say about it. First of all, the Pebblebrook number 8 was actually done as part of the prior year capital budget, but it came in, don't hold me to this, I think it was 60 or 70,000 below the $125,000 budget. So they did very well on that. But not only on Pebblebrook 18 is it pretty close to budget, but that project completed maybe less than 3 weeks ago. And when we issue POs for 2 items that we have a reconciliation upon, and that one of those is labor. They had some possibility of needing outside labor. I think they issued a PO for $15,000, a blanket PO to be used as needed. And once again, as a testament to Todd's, work acumen and usage of his people, I think they barely scratched any of that PO. Secondarily, when they do sod, they issue a blanket PO based on what they think they're going to need for filling in where all the changes were made. And when again, they don't know exactly how much sod they're going to use, so they reconcile that. The bunker project is almost identical to the Pebblebrook 18. In this instance, it's on sand, so they will have issuances of hundreds of tons of sand, they don't know how much they're going to need. And so as that project just completed several weeks ago, we're still awaiting the reconciliation of that. And also, one of the reasons we don't know the exact number is those Dan and Todd head out into the overseeding, and they're from dusk to dawn virtually every day on making sure that goes well. And, excuse me, and golf maintenance vehicles is pretty straightforward. So overall, golf maintenance looking pretty good. The next 5 are just random, if you will, because they don't really carry the weight of, say, golf maintenance. So admin, these are mostly, the biggest items in there are vehicles for maintenance department, as well as CC&R was approved for a vehicle this year, and I think that's looking working very well. I think Riley will tell you that they have a working vehicle that gives them a lot better appearance when they have to discuss items with owner members. Golf ops was one item alone. It was a Pebblebrook installation of a driving range over at Pebblebrook. And this actually looks bad, but it actually was a success story because there was initially thoughts that that was going to be almost 20,000. And so the bids came in at about 11. So, I don't like to ever be over budget, but it could have been worse. Recreation is made up of a whole bunch of items. Real briefly, spa and pool heaters, fitness equipment, audiovisual equipment, landscaping vehicles, tables and chairs, ozone systems, all those compile into there and doing very well against the budgeted amounts. HVAC's pretty straightforward. And the pavilion had 2 items. One was electrical changes for MIMOs or memos. I've heard it both ways. And also sprinkler heads over the lanes were getting antiquated. So I think that was about 25,000 and it came in at about 15. So sports pavilion and the overall summary for this potpourri of items is doing very well. And the next ones I kind of call Carl's World, if you will. Parking lots, roofs, flooring. First one for parking lots was over at Pebblebrook Pro Shop. Did very well. 2 roofs have been done or are PO'd to be done. And that's at Beardsley Arts and Crafts in the library. Did well on those bids. And flooring had Palm Ridge Summit Hallway, as well as Beardsley's Photography Sagebrush. And we had savings on both of those. I talked briefly before the meeting, Kathy, right? And so allowances, I think everybody has a general understanding of that, but if we're not absolutely sure, the governing board establishes allowances for items that historically needed to be repaired quickly and are not defined. Some of the more obvious ones are security, safety, unexpected equipment repairs and HVACs or wells out at the courses. So, and IT this year we added. So there's a 435,000 allowed. This is more like a thermometer. So after essentially 1 quarter, we're running, just barely over 10%. So those are looking pretty good. This allows the general manager also and the governing board to not have to convene a special meeting every time there's a break out there, because it gives him the authority up to 50,000, but you can see we're not doing very many year to date. So any questions on capital? Good, we'll move on to the reserve study. This is the factual as of August. The first, I mention this every time, I just kind of like to always have it be reminded out there that in the middle you can see the 24.7 million, that's the Vanguard Fund. Up above that 3.8 is the JP Morgan funds. The Vanguard funds have three core requirements. One is that within the funds themselves, they be allocated at a 60% bonds, 40% equities ratio. Second is that they are invested only in index funds for those equities. And lastly, the percentage of any individual fund can never be over 20%. That's for diversification. Down at the very bottom, you can kind of see that if you were to be reminded of the income statement I presented at the last PNF through August, there's been unrealized gains of about just about 1.2 million through August. This isn't the update for September, but we saw a little bit of a swoon in there. I think we'll be down, 391,000 from that when we post our September data. So you can't lock those in, but still, year to date is in a good position. So I think I was talking to Kathy as well, and I think most of you know this is also a very fluid document, but it's what we call our what if statement. The point of this meeting was to focus on reserve funds. So in the bottom, you can see we carried over 27.246 as we exited out of June. And so I go up to the budget and what has occurred through August. On the operating, we're at 535,000 ahead of the budget on the operating through August. Club funded's pretty immaterial, and I think that actually is likely to be extinguished in the next cycle. Restricted earnings are right on track. I think we were within 1,000 or so on the budget for dividends and interest on those funds. The unrealized gain, you saw me highlight it on the previous slide, and so I carry it forward. It's put in red because I update that every month. And the APFs right now, I think, are 18 or 19 ahead of pace through either August or September. A good start for that as well. You move down into the capital spend portion, and you have the 5.9 million that we talked about. Nothing more to say about that until the end of the year, but at the introduction I made to you on the capital spend earlier, we're at about a 240,000 ahead of that. So going down to the very bottom, this is a very fluid number, but always in the 51 as we exited out, 54% with the unrealized gains now. And if you look out 5 years, we're still on pace to be somewhere in the 54% range, with almost 27 million as projected. Of course, we all know this is a what if, so things aren't locked in stone, but we're well above the 40% floor that the governing board passed last May. So that's my update on that. Any questions for that?
Pete, will you have the, will you have the September financials for us at our meeting in 2 weeks?
Yes.
Thank you.
Question? Yeah. Pete, on the, again, this is just my second meeting, so on the capital reserve fund, you go out 5 years. Does this committee, I don't want to say has oversight, but does this committee view the 10-year capital reserve fund? In my opinion, I hope the answer is yes, but the first 5 years, I call it more just in time. And the 5 to 10 years, I call, you give it your best, look at it, but it gives you a sense of what tsunamis are coming at you financially.
Very good point. For compression for this, otherwise it gets really, really small. During the budget cycle, we actually do put out the actual R&R requirements for the next 5 years. We summarize that into the capital spend that comes into here. And generally speaking, during that budget, when it's not so worried about compression as it is for what is the broader spectrum of time, and we do push the 10-year out as well. Just FYI, I don't want to hold myself to it, but I believe it's still in the mid to low 50s, even at the 10-year mark.
Thank you.
Anyone else on the committee have a question? John? Terry? No. Thank you very much, Pete. Appreciate it. Last meeting, we touched briefly on our goals for our committee, and the policy statement C03 for the standing committees of the governing board gave us 4 different policies or goals for us. And I added on there to represent the Budget and Finance Committee in our community. I'd asked the committee if they had anything else they wanted to add, so at this time, we'll just kind of have a general discussion. If anyone wants to add anything. Lou, I'll start with you.
No, I think it's pretty comprehensive. You know, I don't know how granular you want to get, or, but I think we could wordsmith it to death, but I think it encompasses our goals.
Thank you. Harry? Terry? John?
Nothing to add.
Okay, Kathy? Okay. Thank you so much. We will keep these as our goals for this year. And we're going to move on into policy review, which is one of our goals of the committee, which is review all aspects of the financial policies and financial plans and make recommendations. So I had gone ahead and looked at these and made a couple of red lines myself, but I don't want, I'm not the final word on these. So we're going to take these in order, and we'll see how far we get. We're not having a meeting that goes through lunch today. So starting with FI 01, this is the accounting for capital assets. And you will notice under 3.3, what I added was the CFO will report to the Budget and Finance Committee through the capital tracker on a monthly basis. And that's something that Pete will be doing for us every month. That just was not part of this. Now, I'm going to ask you all if you've had a chance to look at these and review them, and if you know anything that needs to be changed in these. This one was last reviewed and revised last October. So some of you who may have been on the committee last year may remember this. So I'll just go around. Kathy, I'll start with you. Do you have any changes?
Yeah, I do. Usually in a policy, you don't get quite as specific as capital tracker, the name of a piece of software, I suspect. I would suggest to keep this longer lasting, that you remove that. I think the key piece here is that the capital budget and update on that goes to the Finance Committee in terms of reviewing it and looking at it. So I just find that capital tracker, next time you change to facilities management software or whatever. So I think the key is that we need to be flexible also to see a report that for some reason may not fit into capital tracker, and we may ask for something more than that. I can't think of an example right now, but so I would suggest maybe taking the word capital tracker out and really get at the point of that. But I can live or die by either way.
Would you suggest then striking the words through the capital tracker?
Yeah.
And just those 4 words coming out?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm making that change now and we'll go ahead and see what other changes there may be. Thank you. I appreciate your comment.
Right. And of course, other people may comment too. If you don't agree with it, feel free to.
Anything else, Kathy? Thank you. John?
Yes, I'd like to drop down to policy number 12.
Well, we're going to take
Do
these.
you want to take just number
We're
1?
gonna take these
Okay,
in
we're going
order.
to take each one.
Yes.
I misunderstood. That's
No, we're gonna-
No comments on number.
No, in fact, we're going to have a discussion on 12 later because it has already been redlined, and we need to have a discussion on that. So, any more on FI 01 though, John?
No.
Terry? No. Harry?
The only thing I noticed is in 2.0 General 2.1, it says the minimum cost of $5,000. and then, or 5 years, 5 or more years, and then you go to 2.2, it talks about 10 or more years. Shouldn't they be consistent?
2.2.
One refers to lifetime costs or the overall years. This is Kathy, and this is just my read on it. And the second, it really relates to a dollar amount.
But it also says useful life of 10 or more years on 2.2.
I'm seeing that,
Yeah.
yeah. Expected useful lives of 5 or more, minimum cost of 5,000. Useful life of 10 or more and increase the value. Okay, I'm wondering, capital asset is property owned by the, okay, land, buildings, equipment, and vehicles. And then the next is acquisition, modernization, major maintenance, improvement, or expansion. So I'm not sure they're talking about the same thing. How does, I'd like other minds to weigh in on this. Pete, do you have a,
I believe what you're focusing upon is correct, though. I think that should be 5 years.
it should be 5 in 2.2. Okay?
I think Harry made a good catch.
Just for my clarification, if you have a capital asset, I'm not quite sure how to say this, but if you have a capital asset cost that is within 5 years, under the 5-year mark, but over the 5K, it's still okay for the board to act on that, approve on that, within this policy.
That's my understanding.
Okay.
Yeah. What we would do here is on 2.2, we would change that a useful life of 10 or more years. We would change that to a useful life of 5 or more years. Does that make sense to everyone? Pete, what do
And
you?
with your blessing, let me check with Karen Woods, Art and Accounting. Unless you're planning to advance that today, it probably won't have any impact.
We can hold this if we need to?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go ahead and see if there's anything else that we need to do on this one. Lou, did you see anything on this policy else?
No, I'm good with it.
Okay,
Other than the requested change.
okay.
Madam Chairman, this is John. I have a suggestion
Yes,
that we just clone the verbiage from the last sentence of 2.1 and insert that as a red line into 2.2 so that they read exactly the same way. It should be, if it's a capital job, it's $5,000 or 5 years. And just make it the same.
well, it's 5 or more years and a minimum cost of 5,000.
Just
Right.
as long as the wording is identical, the last sentence. I think that's what Harry had caught, and it just seems to me, you just make it consistent, and it's done.
Do we need to have on 2.2 the increase the value of the facility? Kathy, what?
Yes, I would suggest we send this back, and they've heard our questions, and maybe rewrite it for that clarification, so that we're real clear, as opposed to trying to wordsmith it at this point. Then we can look at it next budget.
I couldn't agree more. Just to clarify, Karen Woods is the accounting. She completely operates the fixed asset system. The governing principle for any accounting program is known as GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Practices.
Right.
She has a guide that we, and virtually every accounting bookkeeper should use, which references the lifespan of thousands of items. You do have the right to issue your own operating practices such that if something is less than 5,000, you do have the right to proclaim it as immaterial to the overall operation, and you can render it that you just don't want to deal with it on an amortized depreciation type basis. So that's pretty clear on 2.1. 2.2, I do want to check with her, only because it's a possibility that those items that are referenced into 2, for whatever reason, might have a lifespan that doesn't ever descend down to 10 or less. So I'll just clarify and get back to you. This is a slow, I hate to say, it's a slow-moving animal, and we might as well get it right.
Okay.
And just one last comment, if you don't mind. Under 2.1, I think our challenge has been this. The first sentence refers to a capital expenditure. The second sentence refers to a capital asset. So I think we just need to make sure we're clear on understanding what relates to what. So I'm fine.
And
Yes.
if I'm reading 2.2 correctly, it is specific, the 10-year is specific to construction projects, which are managed.
That's exactly what I'm getting to. I want to go talk to Karen.
Okay.
If in fact, I'll be blunt, Kathy was shaking her head, and I suspect all of you have been exposed to fixed asset systems. This policy says anything less than 3 years, once again, to not have thousands of items on our fixed asset system that we expend and $25 million spend every year. We don't want that. It would be extremely voluminous. So these definements are protocols, but to be completely blunt, the governing board approves these projects. Karen is going to take those and apply the gap number regardless. And it's a nice thing to have, but quite bluntly, it doesn't impact how we run the fixed asset system.
It might help to put a little heading in there. So, for example, 2.1, if that refers to capital expenditures, capital project, capital whatever, or 2.2, and then the definition follows from there. If your Budget and Finance Committee is having challenge with this, I think we need to probably at least revisit how it's set up or worded. I'm not arguing against what the words are, per se. Thank you.
Yes.
Lane, on this one, I think all 2.2 says is who has oversight of anything that has a 10-year lifespan, not of who's approving it, what it is, where the capital tracker, where it falls. It's just saying that if it's 10 years or more, our construction department there, our construction projects are managed by facility maintenance department. I think we're reading too much into 2.2. It's just who has oversight on it. That's my own opinion.
Yeah, I don't think we're looking at who has oversight. I think we're just looking at the clarity of the definition here. And if we're
The clarity of
having,
definition is the oversight who has it. I disagree with you, but that's fine.
yeah, if the Budget and Finance Committee is having a challenge with understanding this, a simple heading or something leading into it, I think would help us.
So I agree. Let me meet with Tim DeAngelo, Karen Woods, and we will formulate, or we'll review each line on these 2 items, structure it in how it complies with our current operational practices, and get it line itemed out specifically for you.
Okay.
And we should be able to have that by the next meeting.
Okay. Kathy, would you like to meet with them to, okay? I think it would be helpful to have someone on the committee meet with them. And so you will meet with Pete and, did you say Tim? Okay. Okay. Anyone else on the committee have any comments on this? Okay. We will put that, we will come back and revisit that policy next meeting. The next one that I have is FI02. And This one is the capital expenditures budgeting. And talks about the process. So, does anyone have any comments to make on this? Harry, I'll start with you.
No comments.
Lou?
No comment.
Kathy? John?
No comment.
Terry?
No comment.
Then I think we can mark this one as reviewed as of today, and there will be no revisions to it. So we have consensus on that. The next one I want to look at is FI 17, and John Hobold is probably very familiar with this one. The asset preservation fee. This was looked at extensively last year, and some changes were made. I know that Deb Long has been very instrumental in this particular one. And what I would like to ask today is, John, I would like for you and Lisa Vines to please meet with Deb to see if there are anything that has transpired since this was last adopted in February. Would you be willing to do that?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. And I will talk to Lisa since she was not here today. And there's not a rush on this. I'd like to get it maybe taken care of sometime in November.
Anything is fine on timeline.
Okay, thank you very much. And before I move on, I want to ask the other committee members if you saw anything on here that you felt needed to be changed. Terry?
No.
Kathy?
No.
Lou?
No.
Harry? Okay. So John and Lisa will work with Deb Long on that. There may not need any changes to be made, but this has been one that has been rather fluid with the capital tracker, and I want to make sure that we're capturing everything we want to capture on this. The next one is FI 03. This is the property owner changes and refunds of member dues and fees. This is one that was reviewed and revised also last October, and spells out in pretty good detail what happens when property changes ownership, and talks about refunds on member dues and member fees. So we'll go around and see if anyone has any questions or changes on this. Terry?
No, no changes.
John?
No change.
Kathy?
None?
Lou?
No change.
Harry? Okay. Hearing no changes, we will mark this one as reviewed as of today with no changes. Moving on to FI 04. This is our reserves fund policy. This was last reviewed in May of 2020. And it governs covers the funding of future major repairs, replacement of capital assets. I did not see any changes myself, but I want to hear from my committee. So Lou, I'll start with you.
No change.
Harry? Terry?
No change.
John?
No change.
Kathy?
No change.
Hearing none, we will mark this as reviewed on 10/6 with no changes, no revisions. FI 05 is our insurance policy, and it covers the requirements and determination of our reserve and talks about the insurance. This was last reviewed and revised in October of 19. I did not find any changes to make, but I want to hear from my committee. Kathy?
This is just for my information only.
Yes.
The insurance piece, of course, from a budget and finance perspective, comes with some financial obligations. Does this Budget and Finance Committee ever see the insurance presentation, or is that just reserved for the board?
Pete?
Yes, it's all three of the insurances, including one today on health insurance, work comp, casualty, and property, are presented at the intervals in which we're renewing them. The health insurance has January 1, work comp is January 1. We don't get work comp premium or bids until early December. And casualty has an April 1 effective date. So, yeah, we typically do that in March.
Okay. Thank you, Pete. John, do you have any?
No change.
Terry?
No change.
Harry? No change. Lou? Hearing none, we will mark this one as last reviewed on 10-6 with no changes. Next, we go to policy FI09. For those of you who may wonder about 6, 7, and 8, there are no 6, 7, and 8 to review. Those are left available for things that may be filled in. So the FI09 is an owner-developer investment fee. It talks about a facilities fee. We have the right to determine whether to permit owners or developers of undeveloped residential property to provide association facilities access to their prospective residents. And this was reviewed a year ago in October of 19. I was not on the committee, but I'm assuming this was in conjunction with the new housing development that will be going in near Hillcrest Golf Course. So once again, I'm going to ask if anyone on the committee sees anything that needs to be amended on this. Harry? Luke?
No change.
Kathy?
None.
John?
No change.
Terry? Okay, we will mark this as reviewed on 10/6/20 with no changes. FI10 is our procurement policy. These are the parameters to use for all purchases, leases, receipts, and accounting for goods, supplies, and contractual services. So we list out the parameters for the purchase amounts, the bidding requirements, and who has approval to do this. This was last reviewed and revised in October of 19. Once again, Kathy, do you have any changes or
I just
questions?
have a question. It relates to number 4 in here. Any lease or rental contract exceeding 6 months in duration, blah, 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 CFO and general manager. As a Budget and Finance Committee with fiscal responsibility, do we ever get to see those obligations and how it might impact the budget long-term?
I got good news for you. We don't execute any leases or rentals,
But if it does happen,
if it does happen. But
should we?
Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. John, do you have any questions?
No comments, no questions.
Terry?
No questions.
Harry?
No questions.
Lou?
I don't have any questions, but I think it's presented quite well. I like the breakdown, and I think it was a job well done to explain the amounts and the approval process.
It is, it's very well-written statement. So we won't mess with the current success of that. We will mark that as reviewed on 10/6. The next one is FI11 with Disbursement Authorization. This one was last revised in October of 2016, and it has been redlined. To take out the word "his," it says, "The treasurer shall be provided with copies of the check registers for all disbursements for review." So we have eliminated the word "his." Does anyone have a comment to make on that? Lou, I'll start with you.
No comment, and I'm glad we're going to be politically correct.
No comment.
Harry, no comment. Kathy?
I support.
I knew you would.
No comment.
John, Terry. Okay, we will mark this one as last revised on 10, well, we have to get approval. So this one will be redlined and taken to the board, correct, George? This will be redlined, taken to the board.
Madam Chairman, that will go to the workshop this week for review and then for final vote at the end of the month.
Thank you. We're skipping FI 12 that John can't wait to discuss. That will come later. Going on to FI 13, which is our collection policy. This is with respect to the collection of homeowner fees and/or assessments, which fortunately we have not had assessments, thanks to some good financial management. So once again, I will go around and see if anyone wants to make any changes. This one was last revised in October of 2018. Terry, do you have any comments on this one?
No comment.
John?
No comment.
Kathy?
No comment?
Lou?
No comment.
Terry?
Comment.
Okay, we will mark this as last reviewed. Whoops, it was last reviewed last month, I'm sorry. We made a change last month, so. That one moves forward. FI 14 is the village store. It just establishes the village store to provide a retail sales outlet for the sale of arts and crafts item by the chartered clubs in Sun City West. This was last revised in May of '05. So once again, Lou, do you have any comments or changes?
I do not.
Thank you.
No comment.
Thank you, Harry. Terry, none. John?
No comment.
None.
Kathy? None. We will remark this as reviewed 10/6/20 with no changes. The next one is FI 15, which is preparation of the annual financial plan. This is one that spells out the budget timeline. And having done budgets in the past, as I know others of you have, I looked at this and I was surprised it didn't go over many years because it seems to go on for several years. But at the moment, it would be very difficult, in my opinion, for us to make any changes coming up on the next fiscal year. But I do think that this is something that we probably need to address. I think at least get some input on how this might be condensed into a little bit shorter time frame. However, we do have some ramifications in needing to put it in the rec center news, according to this policy, by the 1st of May. To put something in our rec center news by the 1st of May means that we have to have a budget by the 1st of April, which is 3 months prior to when it would start taking place. So that's an aggressive timeline. The workshop, governing board workshop discusses it in early April. The governing board gets a draft budget in March. The Budget and Finance Committee gets a draft budget in March. So there is a lot that needs to go on. I'd like to hear from Pete Finnelli if he thinks this is the best timeline
No, couldn't agree more. COVID really, in a way, helped the process last spring because there was so much adaptation going on that essentially we were moving the budget, revised budget, making sure we hit all those various committees that you're talking about. But I do believe that when Bill and I formatted the structure of it as we entered into it, some of those timelines created some compression that doesn't have to be that way. And so I welcome revisions to this.
Well, I'm not sure a committee is the best one to tell you how.
Oh, I will give you the framework of how I propose it, but I won't just do it without ignorance to the policy.
Sure, I appreciate that, but I'd like to hear from the committee what ideas they might have concerning this policy. Kathy? Okay, John?
My view from sitting through this last year was it was convoluted, overly extended. I felt sorry for Carl, who probably had to give the same presentation 10 times to numerous different audiences. And if that could, it has to be possible to streamline that process, which would benefit not only the staff, but the community in getting a better process. It needs work.
Interesting on that. I was part of this in my short tenure here, but I do recall actually those committees begging to be involved into it. And so I know we made revisions to, I believe, chartered clubs may or may not have been on budget presentation in the past. They were added. The sequencing within the policy sort of dictated, and yet the calendar didn't always, correlate. So we got through it. I think Bill could attest that last year might have been more convoluted than normal because we were doing everything virtually. We were also making pretty sizable revisions to the capital that, generally speaking, doesn't get quite that much attention, but we were doing with deferred amounts to satisfy, in our own opinion, but also governing board concerns about what would happen if we continue to have COVID impact on our revenues, on our expenses, or on our housing sales. What would we react? So that kind of made the capital portion really, really highly profiled and getting a lot of opinions on it. So.
Bill, do you have any comments you'd like to make on that?
Just briefly, if I may, there's a couple of things I think exist here. Historically, back before cell phones, back before the communication age that we're currently in, there was a lot of departure, I think, in the past, people getting out of here in the summertime, so hence the budget thing was moved up forward, to get people out of here in May and June, because we do have a July deadline to have this thing approved, so that kind of played into it a little bit as far as the timing goes. As far as last year's budget goes, that was nothing compared to the first year where we didn't have a CFO. Bring on Tim D'Angelo and Employee of the Year, and he really rocked the boat as far as that one goes. But yes, as far as, I think Pete mentioned it, there are just a lot of steps in the process. A lot of public meetings, 3 are mandated that outside of the Budget and Finance Committee. We have 3 community meetings at the whole, and then a series of committees, other committees that are forced to render their opinion into this budget process too. So it does take time. So we can maybe at your next meeting at least spit out what we've got laid out as a calendar goes, as far as how we have to meet our deadlines and getting everything presented and prepared and put into a presentable form. So it does take a little bit of time, but can it be condensed? I hope so.
Okay, I would agree. Let's see, Terry, had I called on you? Okay. Terry? No comment. Lou?
I'm a fan of the format that was used for expenditures. I'd like to see April, May, June, July, and then what is required in those months. Now, it says that as I go through this, but, I like that kind of format to say, this happens sequentially, but if you will, the sort order would be by month. For me, it makes more logical sense.
Okay, we need to decide if this is something that we can tackle right now, or if we need to leave it alone and get more information from Pete and Bill.
We'll definitely have.
Oh, Kathy, I didn't
discussion-
get back to you.
Oh, that's okay. I do think it needs to go back and let them have a chance to figure out what might be smoother or more condensed in this. I'm a huge advocate of what I call visuals. I'll talk with them a little bit, but if we had a timeline with little boxes on January, what happens, February, March, and then if there's another subcommittee, 65 to 70% of the people in the world are visual learners, so, and I think I'm one of them, so.
I know I am, but
But I'd
I
be
know
happy
I
to-
had to draw out my little timeline.
That's exactly what I did.
Going through this whole policy and figure that out. So I think this is one that we will need to revisit. And Pete, I'm not trying to make work for you, but you're the one who's going to be the beneficiary of any changes.
I
that are-
welcome it. I very much welcome it. I could tell you 2, maybe 3 main covenants that occur. This was brought up somewhere, Bill, recently, where December 1 was being discussed. Ultimately, I think Russ communicated on that this, I believe, is for chartered clubs to present their budgeted capital items through the CR13 process. We really do want to retain that December 1, because when they move into new, it carries a whole review component all by itself. Reserve and repair and replacement. So I give a lot of comfort, I hope, to every person around this committee that R&R items on the list don't just automatically move into the capital budget item. Every single one of them is reviewed, and it's kind of my understanding that, once again, I think properties is assisting in that process by walking around all the campus and rendering their communique on that. But every director, starting with whatever date I put onto your calendar, and by the way, we're doing it all the time, but it goes into formal, okay, are you ready to lock this in? And that becomes the R&R component. The last one's the trickiest one of all, though, and we're not like ignorant of how to make this work, but generally speaking, the operational budget works best when you have a 6-month actual spend, and you'd have to see this program that Karen Woods, who helps me with the budget, takes the actual, has 2- and 3-year prior year runs on every single operational budget item. Those are departmentalized and sent to each director. But just like you wouldn't want to have 1 week, 1 day to get back to them, if we're being fair with them, mid-January, they are getting their run rate, all the detail, what they are going to present. With, of course, being the biggest component being labor, and we work on that well before that 6-month window. But all the other expenses, they are asked to render what's changing. And generally speaking, though, I'd say by the end of January, maybe early February, we're starting to get that formatted. So you start to look at that calendar, and it starts to get compressed. But I'm almost certain it was, I think Bill was alluding to this, that COVID, from a B&F standpoint, I remember we presented our budget like mid-February, and quite bluntly, it was kind of just sailing along. Capital, operational, they were all getting thumbed up. And, well, then we saw 1 month later the challenges that were occurring on the revenue streams, on the expenses, capital. I mean, it was thrown into a lot of disarray. So I'm talking to myself here when I say, we've got to give ourselves enough time to be a good and reliable budget. But if all the parties need their thumbprint at certain times, we may have to look at that timeline. And at the back end of May, and the final approval at June seemed reasonable. We had it pretty much buttoned down. It became almost just rubber stamped, if I remember right. So May and April were the ones really where it got weird. And you're correct, and maybe that's one revision alone, is the timing on Rec Center News, and Katie's over there, and I present things to her all the time. You're correct, we actually had to be out ahead of the curve for the publication. So to think that maybe that's the one key item that might have to get some revision on it. Or it's published in some other format, and then to Bill's point, where those 3 open forums, you know, if those agendas are published, then the 48-hour rule could apply. And these are all just discussion points, but I'll tell you that was one of the trickiest ones.
Well, thank you, Pete. I appreciate your input, and quite frankly, I would feel unprepared to make any changes to this policy because so much of this is operational. And I don't think this committee is set here to tell you how to run your department. So we're going to leave this one that you will review this and let us know of anything you might need to be changed. Is that okay with everyone? Lou, yes.
It is a complicated process. I think for me to better understand it, I'd like to see a flow chart sort of presentation because we say we're going here, then we're going there, and
Agreed.
I'm not exactly sure where we're going. So if it were in a flow chart format, I think it's just easier to understand the time frame implications.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we will move on to FI 16. This one is the reporting of financial performance to the governing board. It's pretty cut and dried. It says that the general manager will report to the governing board financial performances at the meetings of April, September, October, and January. Let's go around. Lou, you have any comments on this?
No change.
Terry? Terry?
No
John?
change.
Kathy?
No change.
Okay, we will mark this one as reviewed 10/6/20 with no changes. And the last one we'll talk about here on our policy review for right now is FI 20, which is petty cash disbursements. Just talks about having cash funds available for nominal unplanned expenses. Again, I'll go around and see if anyone has any changes they think need to be made or questions. Kathy?
None, but I typically would see something like this in a business operations down lower. I'm surprised it comes up so high as a policy, but I support it.
I don't know, it was adopted in '02, so. John?
No change.
Terry?
No change.
Lou?
No change.
Okay, we will mark this one as last reviewed on 10/6/20. Okay, moving along to the next item on our agenda, we have a redlined M-01 policy revision that we discussed, I believe, at our last meeting. And this goes down to 4.2.3. And what we are doing is bringing the policy in line with what is currently happening. So it reads, the member cards, the red line policy reads, the member cards of owners of residential rental unit properties shall be suspended. That means their cards will be suspended for as long as a tenant card is active on a property. It used to say that they had to deposit them with the rec center. That is no longer necessary. They will just be suspended. We're able to do that electronically. So what I need is input from this committee if we have consensus to go ahead and take this forward to the governing board workshop. So Lou?
I had rental property here, and I had to surrender the card, so I'm
Yes.
familiar with the process. I really don't, I like the idea of being able to do it electronically. My question is there any event where it cannot be done electronically? I mean, should they surrender, I guess the end point is, should they also be required to surrender it and also electronically void the card?
Bill, do you have any comment on that?
No, most users, I mean, electronically is really the way to go. I mean, it prevents people from having to come into the office or drop off a card and something getting misplaced or those types of things. It's just a little bit more modernized way to control what's going on out there. But I can see where you're coming from. But we've dealt with this, I think, a year or so ago when we were dealing with all of the Airbnb and the rentals and membership cards being left in other people's homes for people to just simply come by and use those cards. But the way we have the operation now, where as far as access and gaining access to facilities is all electronically controlled, it's either on or off. So we don't really physically need to have the card.
But my question is, are there any events where there are not
Electronics?
electronics to be able to manage those who come in?
Yeah. I would say yes.
There are events where you can't do it electronically? Katie?
Yeah, we would have to have a complete shutdown of the computer system, the whole network go down. Otherwise, if they tried to swipe a card, the status associated with it would not give them privileges. At the rec centers and golf, it would automatically default to a public golf rate. Voting, again, it's, in some cases, we don't even give them a physical card. If it's a secondary landlord card, we were printing and then literally walking over and putting them in a file cabinet. So this just is a status associated with the card that prohibits it.
I can tell you that I've gone to meetings and people say, put down your rec card number. There's not an electronic swipe. I'm not trying to, I'm
completely
just saying,
understand where you're
if there are events where an electronic swipe is not available, should that be an issue? I'm okay with just the electronic swipe. I was an IT guy, and I think it's great that we've progressed to the level that we have. I'm just making a point.
I'm thinking, clubs, Katie, where are we at as far as wood shop, metal shop?
So all the clubs have access to Member Validator, which is a live system that you just type in the digits and it says, yes, they're valid, no, they're not valid. That is a literal live update. So if we invalidate them or change them to a rental status, and then 2 seconds later they try to type them in a club room, it will come in as invalid. So in all the scenarios where we think there's an important impact, the electronics will work. If it was, to walk in through a gate at a special event, flash your card, that's as good as someone that's got an invalid rec card as well.
So that only brings up another issue that I have. When it comes to clubs, I believe most clubs, if not all clubs, have their own proprietary system for signing in, et cetera. If my understanding is correct, periodically, the club takes their membership information and bounces it against the rec center data. But that is done periodically, and I'm not sure at what time intervals it's done. But I would ask that the rec center consider a standardized system for all clubs to sign in, because right now, everything's pretty much proprietary by the club, and those clubs that are doing a good job bounce it against the rec center database to see if, in fact, these people are renters, et cetera, or their card is invalidated for any reason. Just another point. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a very valid point, but I think by the same token, you could have someone who's an owner member, but they haven't paid their dues and it's temporarily suspended, and they could still, show a card somewhere or get in, so it would,
I see it all the time.
Yeah.
I'm involved. Since COVID, I'm not as involved.
Right.
But I was very involved with the Silver Club and the Lapidary Club. And I know there are people that had actually rented their place and were still using the clubs because they hadn't bounced it up against the rec center database. I think both clubs do it pretty much on a monthly basis. But, and I understand the reason that this wasn't citywide because of communication issues, et cetera, et cetera. But it's my understanding now that everybody's pretty much connected. That being said, we may just want to consider that. I don't know how, are the violations, 1 in 1,000 really, is the bang, worth the buck? But it's just another point. If we're going to tighten things up, we may want to think about that. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
do you have a problem with the redlining in this particular policy?
I do not.
Okay, okay. I just wanted to get clear on that. Harry?
No problem with the red line.
Terry?
No changes.
John?
No changes.
Kathy?
No changes, but I hear Lou, and I believe there's somebody on the board that oversees the club process or whatever. I think we are here now, past here now, to have the technology and the electronic capability of, instead of going in and somebody handwriting down, when you go into a club, your number, and you sign here, as opposed to just a swipe or whatever. I'm not familiar, obviously, with all what that entails, but I think it's time the clubs step up.
Whoops, thank you. Well, we do have a consensus, then this will be taken to the governing board workshop. Moving on, our next one, John Hobold has been wanting us to talk about a redlined policy FI 12. FI 12 talks about the investment of association funds, and this was last reviewed in May of 2020 and revised. However, the governing board president, George Kay, discovered that in 2015, the board approved that the funds would be invested in a range of 60% fixed income and 40% equity. That was approved by the board, however, it was never added to the policy. So what I have redlined today to add under 3.0 investment of funds is 3.1.2.3, which says funds shall be invested in a range of 60% fixed income and 40% equity. What we're doing with this is just bringing us up to what is currently the policy, but it was never inserted into the policy. So that is not a discussion of whether that's the right mix or not. It's merely putting into the policy what has already been approved. So, President George, I'm going to ask you, does this have to go back to the board again to
No.
change this policy?
No, the board has to, yes, approve it for adding it to the policy, but not to change it. And again, this is more of a housekeeping than anything else. In 2014, they decided on, that this was the right mix. 2015, the board approved this by unanimous vote, and unfortunately, at that point, it was never typed into our policy. So basically, what we're doing is bringing this, what's been voted on and approved, into our policy to make it correct. And then from that point on, how your committee decides whatever they want to do, and Pete and all that, that's what it is. But again, before this happened, there was no ability for us to actually have a thumbprint on that number being batted around. Because I'm sure if you've been in the community more than a week or two, that's the number that's batted around all the time, the 60/40. And it was never in this policy, but it was approved to be in this policy. Is that about as confusing as can get?
Are you all as confused as I've been over this for the last few weeks since George brought this to my attention? What I need now is a consensus just to add this red line into the policy to bring it into what has been approved by the board, and then I will take it to the workshop. This isn't for any further discussion on this policy at this particular minute. We'll get to that in just a few minutes, but what I just need now is consensus to make this consistent with what has already been approved by the board. Kathy?
I support.
John?
Okay?
Terry? Harry?
I support.
Lou?
Okay.
All right. So we will move this policy forward with this red line to make it correct with what has already been, was already approved and just never was inserted into the policy. Then the next discussion on FY 12 is any other changes that anyone thinks need to be made to this policy. And I know John and Harry were on the committee last year when this was revised and reviewed in May. So I'm going to start with John, because I know has some comments to make on this policy. What do you have to say, John?
Thank you. First of all, to make my position clear, I'm in violent agreement with the 60/40 as a concept. Okay, violent agreement. It's the wording and perhaps a little flexibility that I'd like some discussion on. Maybe we could bring it in. The word range in the redlining, for instance, I'd be much happier with the word target than range. I don't think range fits. And that's, I know that sounds like a picky little point, but especially, we can all remember what happened in March with the markets here, and I know Pete, as Pete presented to us at the last meeting, we were either on the cusp of having to make some adjustments or did make some adjustments. I'd like to hear other opinions, but I would feel more comfortable with maybe a 60% plus or minus 5 on fixed, with the residual in equities or something that provided for some judgment and flexibility depending on the situation. I hate handcuffs. And that's what I've got to say. I don't want to belabor it, but I'd like to see what others with good experience have to say about that.
I'd like to ask Pete just a moment. Am I not correct in that every quarter the investments are rebalanced?
No,
No?
they are not. It's funny, because Tim gave me the September update. You may recall that I said that no fund can be more than 20%. He highlighted to me that one was 20.05. I mean, you and I would probably tend to say, and that was just because that particular fund, I think it was international, had blossomed in the last month, and it, as a percentage of the 100%, it moved beyond the 20. But I wouldn't expect Vanguard to adjust the portfolio unless certain thresholds were met. And I'll have to double check on this. I'm not absolutely sure where this next statement comes from, but I believe in my frequent discussions with Andy Maslick, who's our representative with Vanguard, he generally will say that there's a float of 5% before they're going to act to rebalance. But that certainly isn't written in policy. At least I haven't seen it.
Okay.
So, John, to the range, it actually is helpful. Otherwise, we'd be pulling our hair out, making a rebalancing virtually every day to stay in policy. But I do believe all of these are going to be discussed Friday.
Thank you, Pete. Kathy? Do you see anything else on FY '12
Yeah, I
right
agree,
now?
I agree with John. First of all, I'm used to seeing the word target in this type of, in referring to investments. Second, I'm used to seeing a statement that says a 5% variance, that's a good word, 5% variance, and then a third statement that says consideration of rebalancing should occur when you're within that variance. And I don't know the mechanics here well enough to know, I assume that probably goes to the board, which is the right place for it to go. But I think range and then having a fixed number, I'm with John on that, it just doesn't work for me too well. But I reserved my comments because you said, are we okay with this wording?
Well, the wording came from what was approved
Yeah,
by
I'm not
the
debating
board.
the
and-
60/40. I'm not debating.
No, but I mean, the
yeah, yeah.
range was the word
Oh, the board used?
used,
Okay.
so which is why I wrote it that way. So
Okay.
I agree that target is probably a better term to
Yeah.
use.
But then you have to have the other comments in
Sure.
some way incorporated. So that would be my suggestion, to pass it on to the board for consideration in the conversation, maybe.
Thank you. Terry? Terry does?
Yeah, I'd say three things. If you're going to use the word target, I feel that's more appropriate. Number two, I think it should have a variance. And number three, it should have the authority to approve the modifications.
Approve modifications of,
Approve the rebalancing. If you're going to say there's a 5% variance, that this authority can make these changes. In other words, to say you can have a 5% variance, that's fine, but who? Thank you.
okay.
I think the risk here is if you don't have that and you fall outside that, maybe 20.5. But the point is, you can find yourself, I served on another board where they didn't have the 5% variance, and 2 quarters later, you're hearing about it and the financial loss that you've incurred. Of course, gains we never worry about, but the losses, and you find yourself trying to catch up. I think the key in investments is the constant rebalancing and keeping yourself solid.
Well, I've noted your comments, and I appreciate those. I think for right now, in the interest of time, we will go ahead and move FY '12 forward to the board just to make sure that we are in compliance with what the board approved, and then we will revisit this for changes at a future meeting. Is everyone in consensus with that? Harry, Lou?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Madam Chairman?
Yes. Yes, Jim Young.
Just don't touch it, just speak.
Well, I appreciate your input because I know you've been through this a lot and you've served as treasurer and you've been on BNF many times. And I'll leave it up to further discussions if we even want to leave the 60/40 in. Right now, we're just bringing it up to what happened and never got reflected. Oh, okay. the rebalancing, the rebalancing.
Ian?
Well, I appreciate that, the historical input. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Young? Thank you, Jim, I appreciate that. We're going to move on to 3.06, encumbrances procedure discussion with our CFO, Pete Finnelli.
So I've been a CFO for 35 years, and a lot of the institutions I've worked at, mostly hospitals, have a fiscal year end of December 31, or here, June 30th. It's all over the calendar. Most of the places I've been have a policy or generally accounting practice that for fixed assets, you have to actually have received them in by the end of your fiscal year. And then you don't necessarily have to have an invoice, but if they were on the dock, so to speak, then a receiver was issued, and we would end the year, close our books, and say, capital is as it was. Well, I think this allows, this encumbrance, it's not a policy unique to Sun City. It just allows that purchase orders, construction projects, equipment can be carried over from June 30th indefinitely in the instance of the policy. So I just wanted to clarify that phrase and to give some clarity to the extent of what happened at June 30th. And the middle column is essentially the encumbrance or the carryover. And that 2.6 million, the vast majority of it being the Kuntz project, metal shop and HVACs, you can see them on the list. But this essentially is just communicating that, and I brought this up on the very first slide, that you're going to have purchase orders that are still relevant to prior year. So I get that question quite a bit, is like, what purchase orders have you issued for the current year budget? And the reality is you have to break it out into what components are prior year, and that's not difficult, it's just clarity. So I don't think I've been challenged on it, but I was anticipating getting challenged on it, is if you had 2.5 million and by the end of this year we'd gotten all our projects done, we could have 5.7 million theoretically, plus another 2.5, and someone theoretically out in the audience would say you spent 10 million. Well, you didn't, or 8, whatever that number is, 8.5. Does that answer any questions that we have about encumbrance? Or you baffled us? Sorry. It's really not, we track it on the tracker off to the left, budget is off to the right, and they intertwine when there's new purchase orders issued or actual cash paid, things like that.
Does anyone have any questions for Pete? Kathy? John?
Yes, I have a clarifying question. I'd like Pete to maybe correct my understanding if I don't have it. My understanding is if it's encumbered, funds are encumbered, they're spoken for. Whether or not you have issued the purchase order, or have you... Correct. Have you issued a purchase order?
Not always, 50-50.
Okay, it can be either or.
Yes.
But the funds have been spoken for.
The governing board
And they're eventually charged back to the year in which they were.
No, not the last part. We don't. The governing board approved it, and we had a sidebar, Ann and George, when I was preparing for this. Encumbered can fall off, which is to say, when a director has requested a capital spend in a previous year, and then the need is expired, deemed unnecessary. Quite bluntly, I looked at the policy, there's nothing that actually distinguishes that the CFO or anybody has to go to the governing board and defund it, deactivate it, or anything like that. But I think out of that meeting came a very good recommendation that when we make such a transaction, that we communicate it to you. I intend to do that. I actually mentioned that earlier, that I have one small item that has been deemed unnecessary. And so encumbered carries over the authorization. It could be, and George, I'm not putting you on the spot, but we actively, Bill can allude to this, that I actively challenge our directors, usually once a month, with sidebar emails, that please give me the status of your carryover projects as well as your current year budgets. And that got a little convoluted on the current year because we had to do so many deferrals. But I guess I don't want to say every single month, but usually every other month I'll send an email. Where do you stand on your golf cart, for Pat O'Hara? And he will give me an update that it's still active, still getting it, have other issues that are ahead of that right now. I can't always answer to it. In my history, usually when you give the approval to the director, when, they move forward with it. But I can tell you, I know of several of them that are challenged by getting bids from vendors because so many of them are either bottled up right now with COVID or they're, sometimes the items are so unique that they're very difficult to even get a bid.
Thank you for clarifying that for me and for everyone else. Follow-up question: are you satisfied with the policy and with this process as you need to be?
Yeah, as long as I'm glad to hear that the questions on it are relatively muted. I don't hear anybody yet saying, this is too convoluted and can't be managed. It's just we need to define it into buckets, and I presented it earlier. No questions were really percolated on it, so I'm comfortable with it.
Great, thank you.
And I will tell you, the June 30th or 12/31 in my hospital industry, that was a nightmare because especially I was at 12/31 fiscal year so many times, and now you're going to the vendors. I got to have a delivery right through the holiday period. It's very helpful to have flexibility that June 30th doesn't come and go with the absolute nightmare of trying to coordinate everything getting done.
Okay. Terry? Harry? Luke?
No questions.
Okay. Thank you. Pete, you want to go ahead and talk about our health insurance renewal, 3.07?
I was reading the policy with Kathy earlier. Your chartered club and requirements say that we should present to you the insurance as they are being executed. So this is enacted. We're advising you how the process occurred, but this has already been moved forward for implementation on January 1. So the basis for health insurance quotes, first of all, just a reminder that we actually have a brokerage firm, Hayes, who does execute the bid from, in this instance, our insurance company is Cigna, so they will elicit the quote. I do have one issue. We were talking about budget timing. This one bothers me a little bit, but I don't really have a good answer in that to get a valid quote, you have to have historical data. And we really can't begin to secure quotes from Cigna until, don't hold me to this, but I believe it was mid-August. So if you're going to make any rebuttals to that, it's not that we don't have time, but if you don't like what you get, now you'd have to send out bids to the other insurance carriers, and I'll explain in a few minutes why we did or did not do that. But when you have to have a enrollment with your staff by November 1st to get all 150 or 200 people who have insurance to get their renewal cards and things like that. The process is a little more squeezed than I'd like, but in this instance, it's not undoable, but I would just communicate that. So how does Cigna generate a quote? This surprised me actually a little bit, but most of us in the room, when we buy health insurance, we don't expect the insurance company to look at our individual historical data. We go and we typically have a family or an individual plan, and long gone are the days of, since the ACA went in, where you are limited from insurance by any kind of pre-existing. So over here, when Cigna, I was intrigued to say that 61% of their quote is actually based upon the actuarial data that was generated over just the last 12 months. 39% is on what we'd call the broader market, where they're putting the risk over the millions of other subscribers that they have. So 61% is a little bit closer to self-funded than I would like, but it's the way it is right now.
Pete, excuse me, is that 61% the data from just our particular group?
Yes, so I'll explain it on this grid right here, this next slide. I'm not going to expect you to look at this, but about $1.5 million of premiums are paid annually based on the last 12 months. We have data that shows how much was spent for in-network, out-of-network, and drugs. And sadly, I guess, that the incursion rate of expenditures from our 150 to 200 people who have health insurance spent almost 95% in that in actual claims paid. And so you're going to see in a slide in a second that what was our premium increase proposed, how does that compare against historical? So a year ago when we were bid, that ratio of claims paid to our premiums that we paid was almost in the approximately 70% range. So we've had a pretty hefty increase in the actual usage by our employees. A quick snippet here, 6 to 10% is what we're reading out on the insurance databases off Google, and so with that as the basis, I'll go to the slide of what we're presenting. So the red eye, if you will, go down to 2021 is 9.9%. Primarily, if you'll reckon back to the slide 2 slides back, you'll say that a 95% one is going to position us for Cigna to have to raise the premiums to cover all this loss history that we're seeing. A year ago, they proposed, or Hayes negotiated a 0% hike. But again, you referenced the 70%. From Cigna's vantage point, they're of course going to be much more generous on not raising the premiums. And then now, since so much of it's based upon 61% of the premiums on historical data, they almost had to. A 6-year average of that, though, is 4%. So I think that's actually a pretty good run rate. Health insurance, generally speaking, is higher than that. So the premiums for health insurance are not prohibitive on a 6-year average basis. So this is where it gets very interesting. When Cigna had that 95% claims to premium ratio, they initially presented to Hayes a 26% hike, or almost $375,000 over our approximate $1.5 million. They did their job. They talked to Cigna and said, well, look at the historical actuarial data. They've been running 0 and 1%, 1.1 if you want to look back at that slide. And so they were able to get Cigna to requote it. down to 10%. So their role essentially declined our premium by 60% or almost 225,000. So we're pleased with the effort that they put forward. And by the way, no, we don't pay Hayes directly in this. They secure, I think, a 0.25% of the premium cost paid for by the insurance company. Some other considerations: dental, long-term disability, vision, life insurance. Those are all employee. We don't pay anything for those by the association, but they're offered to the employees if they want to have them, and those are all 0% hikes, so that's good for them. Just to make sure everybody understands, there is stake in the game. There are limits, caps, deductibles, co-insurances. So employees have a stake in that, but at the core level, they have 80% or 20% of the premiums are funded by them through withholds on their paycheck every 2 weeks.
Pete, I have a question. How much do the employees pay for dependent insurance? Or is this for, do we insure their dependents with them?
I'm going to answer that no. It's my understanding, I'll get clarity on this, that the structure of the withholds from the paycheck are designed to represent single person. And then if you act upon that to have further insurance, then you're essentially compensating that whole part of that premium increase. Does that make sense? So
The employee bears the brunt of
Yeah,
the
of the
full
initial.
amount of their dependents.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So a real brief history of the Affordable Care Act. One of the provisions says that insurance companies like Cigna, Aetna, Blue Cross, that the Affordable Care Act said that you have to demonstrate that you paid out in claims 80% of the premiums you collected. Essentially, they left 20% for administrative costs, potential profit margin, things like that. Not on an individual basis by rec centers of Sun City West, but on a global basis, if Cigna presents that to the and I'm not sure, I'm guessing the IRS, that if they have an amount lower than that, meaning 75%, then that 5% gap between 80 and 75 has to be refunded back to the policyholders. And there's no guarantee of that. I'm just saying that that could be a potential. Usually that's in March or April of the following year. As far as bids, the general manager has the authority on this to, granted by the policies, to act on health insurance. Competing bids are secured when, in fact, if he had any disagreement with the amount of the quote, well, when it's 0 and 1% in prior years, quite bluntly, there's not a whole lot of discussion. But competing bids by Hayes would tell you that if you are a brand new insurer, they're going to do exactly what I said earlier. They're going to look at the 12-month run rate. And most likely for Hayes, they're going to be much higher. You saw what initially Cigna proposed, almost $1.9 million. So Hayes is saying, good luck, so to speak, going out and getting anything that's going to be close to better than what Cigna, because they're looking at a broader period of time with this client. The time period that I talked about earlier, meaning that mid-August is when we're first getting some data from Cigna. That's my point on the compression, because you're going to have Hayes go back and negotiate with Cigna. That takes a little bit of time. And then once you do or do not like what they're saying, now it's getting that much closer to the November 1 where you've got to have everything lined up. And that doesn't take just 1 minute. HR would take weeks to get that lined up with and so competing bids, when they're offered, oftentimes will also have kind of a catch you. I mean, we got you at a bargain rate if they do win the bid, but historically, they've made up for it with larger increases. So that was one of the reasons we did stick with Cigna. Again, I mentioned open enrollment. Takes a lot of effort and time to get everybody to get new cards if it was to be a switch, but it takes a lot of time for everybody to check mark. You were referencing dependents. Those change every year. So it's good to have this done and out the door.
Thank you, Pete. Committee members, do you have questions for him? Lou?
Yeah, Pete, do we know why we went from 70 to 90? Why we went, did they give you any input as to the claims? I mean, that's a pretty significant increase from
is.
70 to 95%.
The answer is yes. I don't have it with me, but Marie, Bill, Pete had the meeting with the Hayes representatives. They did have the absolute detail of that 95% spend, and it, of course, is hundreds of pages long. But they did highlight the abnormal ones, and I'm not relinquishing any confidentiality here,
Right.
just in generic terms. There was a particular leukemia patient that
Okay.
was almost 200,000, if I recall. There was I'm almost certain this was correct, it was a very intensive surgical case that went well into the past six figures.
Okay,
And we
so,
just didn't have those in the previous years.
but, well, I guess the leukemia one could probably be recurring, but the special surgical one may not recur. So
I hate to say it's a crapshoot, but
Right.
it is,
Okay.
you know.
I was just curious as to what drove it, whether we can expect that ongoing or whether it was just a one-time deal.
Lou,
Answer.
without getting too, like Pete said, into the HIPAA violations and
Right.
those types of things, the recurring things that you're reflecting are very, very expensive drugs on a monthly basis. And that was the shocker to me when I was going through
Right.
all of the cases and whatnot that we're seeing. But the cost of medicine is crazy.
So we think that the one is recurring, the other was not.
3 recurring, big.
Okay, it is what it is. There are employees, you've got to take care of them. Thank you.
That's true. Thank you. Harry? Terry? No comment. John?
One comment. I think this short mini discussion on this proves the point of the value of looking at the historical rate change. Very sensitive to that, and I think the 4% is, I think it's being well managed. I think everything is in good order, but I think that's why you look at these things over time as opposed to micro detail. That's all.
Thank you. Kathy?
So as I understand this, this is more an FYI for us. This resides with the general manager's ability.
Correct.
You did answer my question. This includes pharmacy. And I assume then, like with biologicals, which would be raising the potential costs on that pretty high, that you have the ability to manage co-pays differently on that.
We do. I wish Denise was here, our prior HR director. Marie has this information as well. I can't specifically tell you the year, but the co-pays and deductibles have been, generally speaking, not changed for quite a few years. They are significant, though. I mean, I'm almost certain there's a $5,000 or $6,000 out of pocket on, so it's not some, executive plan.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Pete. Thank you very
And
much.
just, I think we were bringing up budget.
What's that?
Just FYI on the budget, of course, this takes place in January 1 forward, so there will be some excess to the budget. We didn't budget 10%, but it's probably a $50,000 change over the course of January to June. And of course, we'll incorporate the increase into our next year's budget.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to comments, I have just a couple of housekeeping things to take care of. Just, these are mainly for the minutes, Terry. So On the revisions on FI 11, those are going to the workshop on November 6th, not the one on October 9th. And FI 15 that we discussed, Pete, which is the budget timeline, when do you think this will be readdressed by the staff? Is that something that you want to give us any kind of timeline on?
When's our next BNF meeting? We'll have it done.
I was going to say 2 weeks is plenty.
Okay,
Uh,
so you'll,
I meet weekly. Of course, I'm with them all the time, but
right,
we have specific meetings with Karen and Tim every Tuesday,
but,
and I'll make this priority one.
okay, so we'll discuss this again and get an update from you on our meeting October 20th. Okay, thank you very much. Now I want to find out if any of our committee members have comments. Terry, do you have anything you'd like to comment today? No. Thank you. John?
No comment.
Kathy?
None.
John? John? Harry?
No comment.
And Lou?
Kathy brought up something about co-pays and that sort of thing. You said that out of pocket, probably $5,000 per year per employee. I know that occasionally I hear that we have problems getting staff. How do our co-pays, and I don't need an answer today, but do we ever look at other communities and their health plans? Because it's always a big factor when people come on board. How do our co-pays align with Sun City Grant, et cetera? I would hope that ours are less and we can attract better staff because we're giving a better benefit. But it's just an FYI, casual thing. No study is necessary, just an update on it would be fine for me. Thank you. No other comments.
Thank you. Do we have any remote guest comments today?
Thankfully, I can answer. There are none at the present time.
Okay, then I want to ask the governing board members who are with us today if they have any comments to make. Mr. Young?
I wanted to,
Don't press the button.
I want to comment on two items that you talked about today, and I really appreciate it, and I hope you continue with it, and that is the variance before balancing. I think that's very important. You talked about a 4% or whatever, but I think that's critical. How we missed it, I don't know, but we did. But I think that's very important to keep up. The other problem was alluded to a little bit by Pete, but I've seen this happening quite a bit over the last 6 or 7 years, and that is the bidding process. We're just not able to get bids, and we're going to have to revise our bidding process to some extent. To go out and get 3 bids anymore is sometimes impossible. So I don't know what the solution is. I haven't got any, but we need to at least look at it. But thank you very much.
I appreciate that.
Could I,
President George, you have any comments?
Absolutely not.
Okay, Donna Maloney, do you have any? Sue Fitzsimons?
great idea. Thank you.
Thank you for
And
that
Jim?
suggestion. Our next meeting
And
day. What's
one
that?
real quick, Carl alluded to this, but you brought up how difficult it is to get bids. I'll give you a stark example of that somewhat worked to our favor. Leading up to late January, the large dog park was budgeted in 2019-20 for about $220,000. And I think we might have gotten 2. One was just outrageously like $500,000, and the lowest we saw was $430,000. So we started to progress through the budget process, and then of even deciding how are we going to present this as additional fundings for you guys to, as a governing board, to approve. And that had a little, any of us would have anxiety of having to go for that much more funds. COVID hit, and when kind of release points hit for construction bids to entrench themselves and see where they stand on projects, suddenly Carl rebid it out, and we got like 10 quotes, bids that came in because there was a lot of projects that were being extinguished when funds were drying up and things like that. So suddenly we got a bid for $215,000, if I recall. And so I don't disagree with bids are tough, but we do have a process for managers to declare that they initiated inquiries into contractors or equipment bids. And it's pretty rare that we don't get 3, but they do occur, and we have a process for accounting for that. So.
Thank you, Pete. Our next meeting will be 2 weeks from today, on Tuesday, October 20th, again at 9 a.m. here in this room. I want to thank my committee members and the guests and all those who were in by remote today. And with that, our meeting is adjourned at 10:51.